Alright everybody, welcome back to We Play Games. I'm Walker and here we are with Exploited by Man, Abandoned by God. Now this is going to be our lore video, which is going to be sort of our bookmark for the next couple of campaigns that we're going to be playing, but we're going to be playing just like one character, and then when they die we'll reset the save file and play a different character in the same like broader region, and just playing one generation, because I think one of the things that we've been missing out on whenever we've been just like playing through and keeping the campaign file rolling as long as possible is that a lot of these small cultures and small religions that are on the map never really get an opportunity to thrive. They almost always get just gobbled up by the AI ASAP, and I think just letting them shine and see what we can do with a different character in a different part of the world it should be fun and give us a great way to explore the lore here in CK3 After the End. But before we jump in on the lore for this bookmark in particular, or this pseudo bookmark in particular, I think we should talk a little bit about CK3 After the End for those of you who are new to the franchise. So CK3 After the End is a total conversion mod for Crusader Kings 3 that takes a lot of information from the Crusader Kings 2 mod After the End fan fork, because there's a lot of overlap in terms of staff. But the world that they've built here in CK3 is a lot more fleshed out than the lore that's built into the CK2 version. I think somebody on the subreddit described it once as their own headcanon was that what we saw in the CK2 version was information being recorded by a scribe in St. Louis in the papacy, and so that's why the information got less and less specific the further and further out you got from there. I think there's a certain element of truth to that, or at least it feels good from a lore perspective, because what we're seeing here in the CK3 version is way more granularity when it comes to the different religions, same with the different cultures. Of course, a lot more respect in terms of the power of terrain on the cultures and religions that are going to emerge in different parts of the world. But of course the map is also just like way bigger. Like, for those of you who haven't seen any of the other stuff, all of South America is here. Brazil is no longer off of the map. But this is not a post-apocalyptic scenario, but rather a post-apocalyptic scenario, because the irredentist movements that exist inside of this world no longer have cultural memory of what the world used to be like. The closest that we get to that are some of the cultures and religions that are very, very ancient and understand things from the old world, or at least try to understand things from the old world, or utilize tools from the old world as political and religious arrangements or whatever. But at the end of the day, there isn't really anybody here who's trying to restore what the world looked like pre-event, because nobody really remembers what the world looked like pre-event. So this is a post-apocalyptic world very, very firmly. Pretty much everywhere that there's titles that reach back very, very old, they always have some sort of fakeness to their history. We get the history of the presidency, President Uncle Sam. But there are some things here inside the world that inform the cultures and religions that emerge in our post-event universe. As far as we know, the event was sometime maybe in the 21st century. That's when some of these emergent titles start to come back. But these mountains are older than the event. They're older than the discovery of coal there in the 1750s, or the exploitation of coal in the 19th century. Older than the Great Buzzard that is the Cherokee story. There was a great buzzard flying around the earth after a great flood, and exhausted, it finally discovered land and laid down and became one with the earth. No, these mountains, the Appalachia, are even older than that. These mountains are some of the oldest in the entire world, in fact, and inside of the mountains there are, smaller pieces of the mountains that are older than trees, almost 500 million years old. And this means that this terrain is going to be very, very strange to most humans. It's going to be sitting on top of a massive, thick scar of crust, almost 26 miles thick in some places. Of course, out here in the rest of the crust, depending on if you're on land or in sea, you're going to get maybe 6 to 12 miles of crust before you hit mantle. But this is scar tissue. This is the earth wound. And it's created probably hundreds of millions of years ago by the collision of the North American continental plate and the African continental plate. Now, when plates collide, there's a couple of different kinds of deformation that they can actually undergo. One of them, of course, is subduction, where one of them just like ends up going under the other one and then gets devoured into volcanism. And then on the rear side, you end up with lots of volcanoes on the other side, just, filling in the holes as the plates get devoured. But the North American plate and the African plate decided that they would both bend, but neither would break. And so hundreds of miles inland along the eastern coast of North America, we see the Appalachian Mountains. This is a massive deformation of the crust. Unfortunately for the Earth, it's done the hard work of bringing ancient superpowers into the real world. It's given humans slightly easier access to coal. Coal is this real resource hanging over, exploited by man, abandoned by God. So coal, it's one of these things that's not going to be found everywhere on Earth. To the best of my knowledge, it's formed from plants dying and then being able to decay in anaerobic scenarios, so maybe in like a swamp. And then eventually enough of that decay matter piles up that there's actually something useful there. Then it gets silted over, and then gradually, rather than being devoured by erosion, that anaerobic decomposition gets compressed by heat and by weight as more and more land ends up on top of it. And then that carbon eventually becomes coal. There's a lot more science involved with it, and I'll link down below, but basically it's something that's going to be requiring a lot of work from humans to extract from the earth, because it's buried, right? It has to be buried. There has to be something on top of this anaerobically digested plant material in order for it to become a fossil fuel. And so you need the earth's help generally whenever it comes to extracting some of these things. And here in Appalachia, for better and for worse, they absolutely got it in the form of this plate deformation. It just kind of bent the earth up, and then because of the weathering effects, because these are hundreds of millions of years old, some of these territories provided just very, very ready coal supplies, so much so that when Europeans were starting to do their surveys here in the 1750s, they discovered coal. But because this land is so complex and so strange, it's difficult for humans to make it economically viable to do resource extraction here. Now, there have been developments in terms of resource extraction technologies, like we'll probably talk about it later, but mountaintop removal is one of these processes where people will just come through and basically clear cut mountains. They'll just remove the top of the mountain to get at the coal that's inside, and you're supposed to be preserving land to bring it back afterwards, but tell me if you've seen some of these mountains that are just scars out here. And that's sort of like the next step, really, even for the industrialization of this place. We can talk a lot about the history of Appalachia, but we will probably highlight that in this area, Appalachia is the preferred term. Depending on where you are on the world, you're going to have different pronunciations, you're going to have different regional variants for the different mountains that you're in, like the Blue Ridge Mountains, for instance. But because this bookmark is going to be focused right here, we're going to call it Appalachia. But these people here inside of Appalachia, these are the people that we're going to be talking about today. And the story of coal and the story of these mountains is something that I think you really do need to understand. Because they're hundreds of millions of years old, they actually operated really well as bio-islands throughout most of human development. Until the Europeans really started pushing into it, there were elk and bison and auks, like penguins, living here up until the modern era, right? Very fascinating biology that existed here. There's something ancient in the earth itself because of the way it looks. And it's also very complex terrain because of the way that it looks and because of the weathering effects of hundreds of millions of years. The Appalachian Trail is around 2,200 miles, and generally a through hike all the way takes around 5 to 7 months, whereas the Pacific Coast Trail out here is actually longer at around 2,600 miles, but takes generally around a month less time. And that's really just a story of the terrain. It's complex and difficult to navigate, which is why when Europeans started moving into here, this was a massive forest, because Native Americans really just hadn't found it economically viable to attempt any sort of grand-scale deforestation. And of course, grand-scale deforestation is not like unique to the modern era. It's something that even Native Americans would have exploited, like slash and burn agriculture was necessary at a certain point when it came to human survival in the Yucatan. Like, if you've got trees, you're going to use them. But it was just too hard to get in here. And then, of course, as the 13 colonies got colonized more and more, the Appalachian Mountains just sort of hung over the early history of the United States. They were the western frontier. But then after we gained our independence from the British and then decided that we were going to do some, forced relocation slash genocide, the U.S. government removed the Cherokee people very deliberately and intentionally in the 1830s, in the Trail of Tears. And that resulted in this area being open for Western settlement. And that kind of is also part of the story here in Exploited by Man, Abandoned by God. It's not just that the land itself has been torn apart in search of industrial glory, or that indigenous people were displaced, but that the people who settled here were also being settled into a very, very rough terrain. That this area, largely, it's very difficult to build things in. Infrastructure generally suffers in hills and mountains, and Appalachia is no different. But because it's so old, it doesn't have those same sort of stark tight peaks. It's got lots of complex rolling hills. Like, if you've ever tried to drive in Pittsburgh, I apologize. It's nonsense out there. And it's just because this land is just so old. But the infrastructure problems aside, anywhere there's going to be a resource extraction industry is one of the mainstays for your lifeblood. Whenever that goes away, or if it ever starts to slow down, or for that matter, if the boss is going to be negotiating from a position of power and doing strike breaking, standards of living can be very low. And standards of living out here in modern day Appalachia are pretty low, and it's due to a lot of effects. Like, there's a great video about the Battle of Blair Mountain, but there have been literal wars fought here for control of the wealth of the resource extraction industries. And despite the fact that, the people living here went out and clear-cut a forest at the behest of American capital, and then went out here and clear-cut mountains at the behest of American capital, despite all of that, this remains some of the poorest parts of the United States. Also, of course, getting wiped out by the collapse of industry in the 20th century, and there we see the emergence of the Galvanists. So that's just sort of like the broad umbrella for this bookmark, for Exploited by Man, Abandoned by God. But now we're going to go through and we're going to talk about a lot of the individual religions and a lot of the things that we see here inside of the world. But I do think that it's important to just tell people the story of the land that we're looking at before we tell people the story of the people who are surviving here in After the End. Now, as I mentioned, the Cherokee culture was actually forcefully removed by the US government, and so most of the Cherokee Nation is actually going to be out here in CK3 After the End. But there's still a little bit here just as a nod to the true history of the land itself. But the two cultures that really dominate the area in terms of this bookmark are the Appalachian culture and the Steel Folk culture. Each of these in turn are going to be informed by the resources that they're interacting with, but the Appalachian culture is very clearly one developed right here along the mountains, whereas Steel Folk is one that's sort of developed here along the lake and with more of the industrial bones of this bookmark. At one point I was thinking about naming this bookmark Rust and Bones, because there's a certain element of that as well. But the Appalachian culture, they focus on mining, mountaineer ruralism, tribal unity, resourceful tinkerers. This culture is going to be focused on the interaction with and exploitation of the mountains themselves. But because we don't use coal in CK3 after the end, because we don't use the same sort of fossil fuels. Not only are those things going to be less useful in creating an outward seeking economy, but also that means that you gotta come up with something else to do economically, right? And this culture largely has maintained mining as a tradition because there's other things to mine in the mountains, but because it's going to be broken apart by geography, we see tribal unity, and for that matter, the tribal government form dominating in this area. I think this is going to be a really fun area, of course, with tribal unity and with a lot of unreformed faiths in charge out here. It's going to be very easy for the nations sitting on the outside of this bookmark to try to influence religions and cultures through, just trying to convert people of tribal unreformed. But that means that at the beginning, this area also offers a huge opportunity for players to play, right? A lot of these characters are going to be able to do raiding, and that's very, very powerful in CK3. If you've never played as a raiding religion, you should. And tribal makes it even easier. The Steel Folk, of course, are going to be focused more on the big cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland, with an eye towards metallurgy, right? These are the old steel mills that would be bringing in iron from Pennsylvania and coal from Kentucky and creating out of those things steel. And these steel cities have now fallen apart even in the 21st century. This is the area described as the Rust Belt, where economies are starting to revitalize, but there's been more of migration out rather than migration in. And you can really feel it in some areas. The Rust Belt devours. But whereas the cultures here in CK3 after the end are largely trying to describe the material way in which the humans in this post-apocalyptic world survive, the way that they use their geography to inform the way that they survive and the way they economize, the religions here in game largely describe one thing. They describe trauma. They describe the trauma of the event. So you'll note that the mainstream Christian churches here in CK3 after the end, the Conclavian Catholic Church and the Evangelical Protestant Church down here, and for that matter the Ursulines up here in Quebec, don't really have a foothold in this area, at least not at the beginning of the game. And it's because the people here are angry. They're angry at God, that these people were abandoned, that revelationism, which is of course the thing that's going to stand in closest to the air quotes mainstream Christians in CK3, revelationism itself is actually sort of an offshoot of those big mega churches, those charismatic mega churches that exist in this area in the United States even today. And so they lean into faith healing and the personal magical power of the religious leader, as opposed to the bureaucratic magical power of the religious leader in these sort of mainstream faiths. And of course, revelationism is going to be leaning into things like, snake handling. This is what we're seeing right here, which is something that is actually practiced in some parts of the world in the United States. There's like a snake handling church in West Virginia, for instance, where people try to handle poisonous reptiles in an effort to demonstrate not just bravery and bravado, but also faith that God will protect them, in a sort of shadow boxer sense. But revelationism is the thing that's probably the closest to mainstream Christian churches here in this area. Either that or the Tomb Watchers, who in turn also are sort of obsessed with, or at least informed by, the concept of the event. That the Tomb Watchers are now waiting for the third coming of Christ. Whether or not Christ came during the event is debatable, but certainly not psychologically unimportant. These people had been waiting for Jesus to come and save them from being exploited by man. And then the apocalypse came and wiped it all away. And of course, speaking of the apocalypse coming and wiping it all away, we have the Behemothian Covenant, which is of course one of these things that has taken this anger at God and made it pretty specific. So for those of you who know about Abraham, there was a point at which God in the Old Testament commanded Abraham to sacrifice a son. In Judaism, it was Isaac. In Muslim tradition, it was Ishmael or Ismail. But either way, God intervened in this story and prevented Abraham from performing the human sacrifice. And that was part of a covenant between Abraham and God, which defined the laws of Judaism and also kind of defined the laws of Judaism on God itself, right? God can't do these things like blow up the entire world with floods anymore. That was part of the deal. And now God has backed down on that deal. And so the Behemothian covenant takes concepts from ancient Judaism. I think of this as from a sociological perspective. There was an evolution of taboos on things like cannibalism or incest or human sacrifice that wasn't entirely world spread, right? The human sacrifice was very, very important to the pre-Columbian Mexica. That cannibalism was also tolerated for a longer period of time in China, tolerated with the concept that it was like, oh, it was filial to offer your lord a piece of your leg if they were starving to death, but it was cruel and bad for them to ask it of you, right? And so the development of those taboos is something that's, I think, going to show up in religions as well as in the cultures themselves. And this religion says God lied to us. All of the things that God was having us do post-covenant was all wrong. And so we're going to lean into the oldest things that we can remember. Judaism pre-covenant. And that's what sort of is emerging here with the Behemothian covenant. Omen tellers are really fun. For those of you who don't see what I see, this looks pretty much like an angel that has been synchronized with Mothman, which is a cryptid from this area that's supposed to be associated with like dark omens. There's stories about the Mothman showing up at Chernobyl and stories about Mothman showing up at a bridge out here, and it's a prophecy of darkness. But it's a prophecy of darkness coming from a Christian tradition here in Omen Tellers in-game. Mothman itself is just a fun cryptid. There's a lot of fun cryptids, actually, in Appalachia. I'll link down below in case you're interested in that. But Omen Tellers represent also in the same sense that the Revelationists represent a take on Christianity that has become estranged from the church itself. Omen tellers believe in loaning your lips, being possessed by spirits. And that's something that you can also find really interesting videos for on YouTube if you're looking for them. People speaking in tongues is part of a religious tradition here in this area. So that leads us around to the Galvanists. The Galvanists and the Prometheans are both Industrious and Anachronous faiths, and so they share a lot of things in common, not everything, but they're both religions that try to get past the trauma suffered by the people here in this bookmark by rethinking the way they approach the old world. So the Galvanizing Assembly is an Anachronous faith, which means it's going to try to use technologies from the old world to inform its way of thinking today. But whereas in some of those areas, those social technologies are things like, the concept of the American state. Here in Galvanism, these people practice holy salvage expeditions. They go into the bones of the old world and seek out old technology that they can repair to try to use, or just have as religious symbols and objects. So in the CK2 version, you could salvage up a gun. I don't know if you can do that in the CK3 version or not, but there were things that you could get in the CK2 version that definitely would have worked or been repairable, right? If you could find a compass, for instance, and could fix it, but didn't quite understand the mechanism by which it worked, that would be a magical object. That would be sort of like finding a clockwork machinery and being able to repair that. And that would also be a pseudo-magical object if you didn't understand the process by which it actually worked. And that's what the Galvanist faith and the Promethean faith kind of lean into. They lean into everyday household objects, or for that matter, more advanced household objects from the old world as having religious importance. Now, the patron gods for the Galvanizing Assembly includes things like Rockefeller and Carnegie, but also OSHA. But I think all of these things sort of in turn tell you that the things that were important to these people, or at least the things they remember as being important to these people in a post apocalyptic world, are not the names of the labor fighters like Mother Jones, but rather it's the name written on the library, right? These people worship just as everybody else here in this world. They worship the things that they found. And that's the way that this bookmark is largely going to play out. So we're going to start our campaign with Exploited by Man, Abandoned by God, probably playing High Chief Golden through like one lifetime, and then we'll play somebody like West Michigan because they're a unique religion. But we're going to just be popping around the map and trying to organize things more deliberately around specific bookmarks, and then just playing one character there and just seeing, what sort of religious maps we can get by the end of it, because I think that would be pretty interesting just to see the world of CK3 after the end living on its own. All right, that's Walker. Take care.